This Thursday at my buddy Ben's house, I'm going to be teaching on Matthew chapter 11. And specifically, one of the things I'm going to be talking about is poor people. And how time and time again, Jesus speaks of how the poor are blessed. And how the poor get him and get the gospel. And that rich people tend to have a very hard time with it. At times you'd even say things like, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus is constantly making these connections between our literal materialistic wealth and poverty versus our ability to see the gospel. And in Matthew chapter 11, we have the story of a offended prophet. John the Baptist is offended at Jesus, and Jesus mentions three things that characterize people that are not offended by him, and one of those things is poor people. And I was just sort of thinking about that and studying that, and trying to really wrap my mind around what Jesus meant by that, and came upon some pretty profound truths. One of the things I thought of is just thinking of poor churches. I follow like Voice of the Martyrs and many organizations like that, so I'm very familiar with what churches are like in poor places, and I regularly watch video that I can get my hands on of church services in places like Nigeria, and so I can compare that with what I've grown up in the wealthiest country on earth. And one thing that I've noticed a huge difference is in places like that, quite frankly, Christianity is a supernatural thing. They will speak a lot about blood, and they will speak about incarnation and atonement and resurrection and miracles and so on and so forth. And you come to churches here in the United States, especially rich churches, especially churches where the parking lot is full of Suburbans and Expeditions and $20,000 and $30,000 cars and so on. You're going to hear about how materialism is bad, about how selfishness is bad, about how loving your neighbor is good, and about how benevolence is good, and caring for widows and orphans is good, and things like that. And why the difference? Why the difference between the two? Well, let me tell you the difference. And this is not spoken out loud very often because it's incredibly patronizing and so paternalistic. But the reason why is because ultimately that rich church thinks that poor church is different than them because they're just not as educated as them. Because they haven't got to where they can sort of bring Christianity up to date and realize that all those doctrines, those doctrines of incarnation and resurrection and atonement and all those things, those are, some people believe them, some people don't believe them, but they're non-essentials. And this poor church they're just not educated enough to realize that the essentials of Christianity, the essential things are not being selfish. They're being humble. They're being benevolent in caring for poor people, and so on and so forth. And they think that if they could just be educated as we are, they would understand that these things are the essentials. But so ultimately they think that their intellect is offended by atonement and resurrection and miracles and blood and so on and substitution. They think that their intellect is offended by it, but it's not their intellect, it's their pride, and it's class consciousness is what it is. It is class discrimination of the poor, and and that is why Jesus constantly singles out the poor as those who get the gospel, because the poor know that there are so many factors and so many circumstances in life that affect how they got there, and rich people tend to think that we're self-made people. I worked hard to get here, And indeed, they may have worked hard, but go to, there's plenty of Christians in Nigeria. There's plenty of Christians in all sorts of Eastern African countries or South Central Asian countries that work just as hard or harder than they are, and yet they can barely feed their own families. And they see the poor understand that it's not me, that it's grace, that I got to where I am today because of, not so much because of the things that I did, but because of God's grace, because of God's goodness in my life. And so that's why the poor get the gospel, and that's why for centuries the rich have been trying to change it from a gospel into a philosophy. And ultimately what you're saying, you're revealing something about yourself with the main emphasis of the corpus of what you speak of, when the main emphasis is all about benevolence and anti-materialism and anti-selfishness and widows and orphans and doing all the right things. And you know, maybe you believe in atonement, maybe you don't. Maybe you believe in the resurrection, maybe you don't. Maybe you believe in the virgin birth, maybe you don't. Maybe you believe in miracles, maybe you don't. And all those things, the historic fundamentals of the faith, when you put those things on the back burner and say that benevolence and anti-materialism is the essentials, that's the heart of Christianity, what you're ultimately saying is I don't need a savior, I just need an example to follow. What you're ultimately saying is I don't need a gospel. I don't need good news that's to be heard. I need a philosophy. I need a discipline. I need an ethic to do. And it's not because your intellect is offended, it's because your pride is offended that you go there. And that is why Jesus constantly identified with the poor, and the poor identified with him. Because if you found yourself in a Christian's shoes in Nigeria today, and Boko Haram is constantly trying to kill your family, and you are working 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 hours a day trying to feed your family, and maybe you're accomplishing that, maybe you're not. You understand that all that talk of benevolence and not being materialistic, that's all useless to you. But if somebody comes to you and tells you gospel, see, the word gospel means it's a proclamation of something that's already been done. Well, if somebody comes to you and tells you, well, you know, we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we're not going to be materialistic, and we're going to try to be nice and care about people, well, that does nothing for your situation. But if I come to you and say that God has broken through time and space, and God has intervened on your behalf, and there's this glorious message of atonement and reconciliation, and you can be saved, that gives you dignity, that lifts you out of the mire, and that is why historically, for centuries, the poor have embraced the gospel, and the rich have tried to turn the gospel into an ethic.